The courthouse steps were slippery from the morning rain when Sarah Martinez first saw him. Marcus "Tank" Thompson sat on his motorcycle outside the Jefferson County Courthouse, his leather jacket torn and bloodied, waiting for his public defender who never showed up. Sarah had been practicing law for only 3 years, mostly handling small-time cases and traffic violations. She never imagined that walking up those wet stone steps that Tuesday morning would change her life forever. Inside the courthouse, the bailiff called Marcus's name 3 times before Sarah realized what was happening. The man she'd seen outside was supposed to appear before Judge Harrison in 20 minutes, and his attorney was nowhere to be found. Sarah watched as the prosecutor, District Attorney Williams, shuffled through a thick file with a satisfied smile. This was going to be an easy win for him. Marcus entered the courtroom in handcuffs, his boots echoing against the marble floor. He was massive, standing well over 6 feet tall with arms covered in tattoos that told stories Sarah couldn't begin to understand. The Hell's Angels patch on his jacket was torn but still visible, and she could see the defiance in his dark eyes. He looked around the courtroom like a caged animal, searching for his missing lawyer. Judge Harrison, a stern man in his 60s who had seen every type of criminal case imaginable, looked down from his bench with impatience. "Mr. Thompson, where is your attorney?" Marcus's voice was rough when he spoke. "Don't know, Your Honor. Haven't seen him since last week." The judge shook his head. "This is the 3rd time Mr. Peterson has failed to appear for your case. I'm afraid we'll have to postpone again, unless you want to represent yourself." Sarah found herself standing up before she even realized what she was doing. "Your Honor, I'd like to request permission to speak with the defendant." The entire courtroom turned to look at her. D.A. Williams raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Judge Harrison seemed surprised but nodded. "Ms. Martinez, you're not assigned to this case." "No, sir. But I believe every defendant deserves representation, and if Mr. Peterson isn't here, perhaps I could assist." Marcus looked at her for the first time, his expression unreadable. Here was this small woman in a simple gray suit, offering to help him when his own lawyer had abandoned him. He had every right to be suspicious. Most lawyers, especially ones who looked like they'd never seen the inside of a biker bar, wanted nothing to do with Hell's Angels. Judge Harrison called for a 15-minute recess, and Sarah found herself sitting across from Marcus in a small conference room. The handcuffs clinked against the metal table as he leaned forward. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah took a deep breath. "Because I read the police report this morning. They're charging you with assault and battery, but the witness statements don't match up. The bar fight started when 3 guys jumped your friend outside Murphy's Tavern. You were defending someone else." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. "You know what I am, right? What that patch means?" "I know you're a member of the Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. I also know that doesn't automatically make you guilty of what they're accusing you of." For the first time since she'd seen him, Marcus almost smiled. "Most people hear Hell's Angels and think we're all criminals." Sarah opened the file she'd quickly grabbed from the clerk's office. "Tell me what really happened that night." Marcus's story was different from what the police report suggested. He and his friend Jake had stopped at Murphy's Tavern after a long ride from Phoenix. They weren't looking for trouble, just wanted a beer and some food. But 3 local men, already drunk and looking for a fight, recognized Jake from a previous dispute over a woman. They followed Jake outside and attacked him with baseball bats. "I heard Jake screaming," Marcus explained, his hands clenched into fists, even with the handcuffs. "When I got outside, they had him on the ground and were beating him. One of them was going for his head with a bat. I couldn't just stand there." Sarah made notes as he spoke. "What happened next?" "I grabbed the bat from the guy who was trying to crack Jake's skull open, threw him against a car. The other 2 came at me, so I defended myself. By the time the cops showed up, those 3 were claiming we started the whole thing." The police report painted a different picture. It described Marcus as the aggressor who attacked 3 innocent men without provocation. But as Sarah read through the witness statements, she noticed inconsistencies. One witness said the fight started inside the bar. Another said it began in the parking lot. The timeline didn't match, and the injuries described didn't align with the story the prosecution was telling. "Marcus, do you have any witnesses who can back up your story?" He shook his head. "Jake's in the hospital with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The only other people around were those 3 guys and their friends." Sarah looked at the charges again. Assault and battery with a deadly weapon. If convicted, Marcus could face 5 to 10 years in prison. It seemed like an impossible case, but something about his story rang true. Maybe it was the way he talked about protecting his friend, or how he looked her in the eye when he spoke. She'd learned to recognize liars in her short legal career, and Marcus didn't feel like one. When they returned to the courtroom, Sarah formally requested to take over Marcus's defense. D.A. Williams objected, claiming it was irregular and would delay the proceedings, but Judge Harrison allowed it, setting a trial date for 3 weeks away. As the bailiff led Marcus back to his cell, he turned to Sarah one last time. "Why are you really doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Sarah gathered her papers, thinking about her answer. "Because everyone deserves a fair defense, and because I think you're telling the truth." Outside the courthouse, Sarah realized what she'd gotten herself into. Defending a Hell's Angel wasn't going to win her any friends in the legal community. Her senior partner, Robert Chen, would probably have a heart attack when he found out. But as she walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was important, that Marcus Thompson was more than the monster the prosecution wanted to paint him as. That evening, Sarah drove to Murphy's Tavern to see the scene for herself. The bar was a run-down place on the edge of town, the kind of establishment that had seen better days. She talked to the bartender, a tired-looking woman named Linda, who remembered the night clearly. "Whole thing was messed up," Linda said, wiping down glasses. "Those Thompson boys weren't causing trouble, just having a beer and minding their own business. It was those 3 locals who started it. They'd been drinking all day and talking about how bikers weren't welcome in their town." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the first piece of good news she'd had. "Would you be willing to testify about what you saw?" Linda hesitated. "Those 3 guys, they've got friends. Important friends. I could lose my job." "But you saw what really happened?" Linda nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw it. And it wasn't the way the cops wrote it up." As Sarah drove home that night, she realized she wasn't just taking on a case. She was taking on a system that had already decided Marcus was guilty before hearing the facts. The 3 men who attacked Jake weren't just random troublemakers. According to Linda, one of them was the nephew of City Councilman Bradley, and another was dating the police chief's daughter. Sarah spent the next week diving deeper into the case. She interviewed Jake in the hospital, despite his reluctance to talk. His injuries were severe, and he was lucky to be alive. The doctors said if the beating had continued for another minute or 2, he might have died from his head injuries. "Tank saved my life," Jake told her, his words slurred from the concussion. "Those guys weren't just starting a fight, they were trying to kill me." As Sarah prepared for trial, she began to understand the world Marcus came from. The Hells Angels weren't just a motorcycle club, they were a brotherhood. When one member was in trouble, the others didn't abandon him. They stood together no matter what. But understanding their world and proving Marcus's innocence in court were 2 different things. She needed more than Jake's testimony and Linda's reluctant statement. She needed evidence that would convince a jury that a Hells Angel could be the victim, not the aggressor. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered security footage from a gas station across the street from Murphy's Tavern. The owner had forgotten about the cameras, and the police had never bothered to check. The footage was grainy and taken from a distance, but it clearly showed 3 men following Jake outside and attacking him before Marcus ever appeared. For the first time since taking the case, Sarah felt hopeful. She had evidence, witnesses, and a client who was telling the truth. But as she prepared for trial, she had no idea that her decision to defend Marcus Thompson would bring consequences she never could have imagined. The night before the trial was set to begin, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was calm, but carried an unmistakable threat. "Drop the case, counselor. Some fights aren't worth fighting." Sarah hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She looked out her apartment window at the quiet street below and wondered if she was in over her head. But when she thought about Marcus sitting in his cell, depending on her to prove his innocence, she knew there was no turning back. The next morning, as Sarah walked up the courthouse steps where she'd first seen Marcus, she noticed something different. Motorcycles were parked along the street, more than she'd ever seen in one place. Men in leather jackets with Hell's Angels patches stood in small groups, their eyes watching everyone who entered the building. Sarah realized that Marcus's brothers had come to support him. They weren't there to cause trouble or intimidate anyone. They were there because one of their own needed them, and they wouldn't let him face this fight alone. As she entered the courthouse, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about proving Marcus's innocence anymore. It was about showing that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed impossible. The trial was about to begin, and Sarah was ready to fight for the truth. The courtroom was packed that Monday morning. Sarah had never seen so many leather jackets in a legal proceeding. The Hell's Angels members filled the back rows, sitting quietly but making their presence known. Their faces were serious, weathered from years of riding and living by their own code. Judge Harrison looked out at the unusual audience and banged his gavel for order, though no one was making noise. D.A. Williams wore his most expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case involving bikers. He'd built his reputation on being tough on organized crime, and to him, the Hell's Angels were just another criminal organization. During jury selection, he made sure to emphasize the defendant's gang affiliation at every opportunity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams began his opening statement, "the defendant is a member of one of the most notorious criminal organizations in America. On the night of March 15th, Marcus Thompson brutally attacked 3 innocent men outside Murphy's Tavern. This wasn't self-defense. This was gang violence, plain and simple." Sarah watched the jury as Williams spoke. She could see the fear in their eyes when he mentioned the Hell's Angels. 2 older women kept glancing nervously at the back of the courtroom where Marcus's brothers sat. The prejudice was already working against her client before she'd even said a word. When it was her turn, Sarah stood up and walked closer to the jury. She'd learned that connection was everything in a courtroom, and she needed these 12 people to see past their preconceptions. "My client's jacket doesn't make him guilty," she began simply. "The evidence will show that Marcus Thompson is not a criminal. He's a man who saw his friend being beaten nearly to death and made a choice to save a life. That choice landed him in handcuffs, but it was the right choice." The first day of testimony went exactly as Sarah expected. The prosecution's witnesses told their rehearsed story. Derek Bradley, the city councilman's nephew, testified that he and his friends were minding their own business when Marcus attacked them without warning. His black eye had healed, but he played up his injuries for the jury. "He came out of nowhere," Bradley said, pointing at Marcus. "Just started swinging. We were just trying to enjoy a night out, and this biker decided to use us as punching bags." Under cross-examination, Sarah began to poke holes in his story. "Mr. Bradley, you testified that my client attacked you first, but you were drinking that night, weren't you?" "I had a few beers." "How many is a few?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "I don't remember exactly." Sarah pulled out the bartender's receipts, which Linda had reluctantly provided. "According to these records, You and your friends consumed 14 beers and 6 shots of whiskey between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. That's quite a bit more than a few beers. D.A. Williams objected, but Judge Harrison allowed the questioning to continue. Sarah could see doubt creeping into some of the jurors' faces. If Bradley couldn't remember how much he'd been drinking, how could they trust his memory of the fight? The second prosecution witness, Tommy Reeves, told essentially the same story. But Sarah noticed something during his testimony that Williams had missed. Reeves kept looking toward the gallery where several men in expensive suits sat watching. These weren't bikers or courthouse regulars. They were well-dressed, well-connected, and clearly had an interest in the outcome. When Sarah cross-examined Reeves, she focused on his relationship with the local police. Mr. Reeves, isn't it true that you're currently facing charges for drunk driving in another jurisdiction? That's not relevant to this case. Isn't it also true that you were promised those charges would be reduced in exchange for your testimony today? Williams jumped to his feet. Objection! There's no such agreement in evidence. But Sarah had done her homework. She'd found the deal buried in court records from the neighboring county. Reeves had been facing his third DUI, which would have meant serious jail time. Suddenly, those charges were reduced to reckless driving with probation. Judge Harrison called both attorneys to the bench. Ms. Martinez, do you have documentation of this alleged agreement? Sarah handed him the court files she'd obtained. Williams looked stunned. He'd been so focused on the case that he'd missed his own witnesses' credibility issues. I'll allow this line of questioning, Judge Harrison decided. The revelation that the prosecution's key witness had made a deal to avoid jail time shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom. Sarah could see the jury looking at Reeves with suspicion instead of sympathy. But the prosecution wasn't finished. They called Dr. Emily Chang, the emergency room physician who had treated Bradley and his friends. Her testimony was devastating. The injuries were consistent with a severe beating, Dr. Chang explained. Multiple contusions, a broken nose, and significant swelling. These men were hurt badly. Sarah knew she had to be careful with Dr. Chang. The doctor was credible and sympathetic, and attacking her would backfire with the jury. Instead, Sarah focused on what the injuries could tell them about the fight. Dr. Chang, in your medical opinion, are these injuries consistent with someone defending themselves against multiple attackers? I suppose they could be. If someone were being attacked by 3 men with weapons and one person tried to stop the attack, could these injuries result from that scenario? Williams objected, but Judge Harrison allowed the question. Dr. Chang considered carefully. Yes, that's possible. The injuries could result from either scenario. Sarah had made her point. The medical evidence didn't prove who started the fight, only that a fight had occurred. On the second day, the prosecution rested their case. Sarah felt confident that she'd raised enough doubt about their witnesses, but she knew her real work was just beginning. She had to tell Marcus's side of the story in a way that would make the jury see him as a protector, not an aggressor. Her first witness was Jake Morrison, Marcus's friend who had been the initial victim. Jake looked terrible. His head was still partially shaved where surgeons had worked on his skull fracture, and he moved slowly to the witness stand. But his testimony was clear and powerful. They were going to kill me, Jake said quietly. I was on the ground, and they were taking turns with baseball bats. I remember thinking this was how I was going to die in some parking lot over nothing. Sarah walked Jake through the events of that night. How he and Marcus had stopped at Murphy's Tavern for food, how Bradley and his friends had recognized Jake from a previous incident involving Bradley's ex-girlfriend, how the 3 men had followed Jake outside and ambushed him. When did you first see my client that night? When he pulled that bat away from the guy who was about to crack my skull open. Tank saved my life. Under cross-examination, Williams tried to paint Jake as unreliable due to his head injury. But the young man's sincerity was evident, and his medical records supported every detail of his story. Sarah's next witness was Linda, the bartender from Murphy's Tavern. Linda was nervous, constantly glancing at the gallery where Bradley's supporters sat. But she told the truth about what she'd witnessed. "Those 3 men were drunk and angry when they arrived," Linda testified. "They kept talking about teaching some bikers a lesson. When they saw Jake, they got excited. Said it was their chance." "Did you see how the fight started?" "Through the window, I saw them corner Jake in the parking lot. They had bats with them. When the big guy came outside and saw what was happening, he tried to help. That's when the real fight started." Williams tried to discredit Linda during cross-examination, suggesting she was biased toward bikers because they were good customers. But Linda stood her ground. "I don't care about bikers one way or another. I care about the truth. And the truth is those 3 men started a fight they couldn't finish." The courtroom was silent as Linda finished her testimony. Sarah could see several jurors taking notes, their expressions thoughtful rather than hostile. But Sarah's most important piece of evidence was the security footage from the gas station across the street. She'd had it enhanced by a video expert, and while it was still grainy, it clearly showed the sequence of events. The footage showed Bradley and his friends following Jake outside Murphy's Tavern. It showed them surrounding him with what appeared to be weapons. It showed Jake falling to the ground and the 3 men continuing to attack him. Only then did Marcus appear in the frame, running toward the altercation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah addressed the jury as the video played, "this footage doesn't lie. It doesn't have a bias. It doesn't make deals with prosecutors. It simply shows what happened." The impact was immediate. Several jurors sat back in their chairs, the reality of the situation finally clear. This wasn't gang violence. This was a man saving his friend's life. Williams tried to recover during his cross-examination of Sarah's video expert, suggesting the footage was unclear and could be interpreted different ways. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the truth with their own eyes. Sarah's final witness was Marcus himself. She'd debated whether to put him on the stand, knowing that D.A. Williams would try to destroy him. But Marcus insisted he wanted to tell his story. Marcus walked to the witness stand with dignity, his leather jacket replaced with a simple white shirt and dark pants. He looked directly at the jury as he raised his right hand to be sworn in. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah began, "tell the jury about the night of March 15th. Marcus's voice was steady as he recounted the events. He talked about stopping at Murphy's Tavern for a meal after a long ride. He described hearing Jake's screams and running outside to find his friend being beaten. "I didn't want to fight anyone," Marcus said. "I just wanted those men to stop trying to kill my friend. When I saw Jake on the ground with blood coming from his head, I knew he was going to die if I didn't do something." Sarah walked Marcus through his background. He was a veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He worked as a mechanic and had no criminal record beyond traffic violations. The Hells Angels weren't a gang to him. They were family, brothers who looked out for each other. "People see the patch and think they know who I am," Marcus explained. "They think we're all criminals, but most of us are just working guys who love to ride. We take care of our own because nobody else will." When Williams cross-examined Marcus, he tried to paint him as a violent criminal hiding behind a sob story. But Marcus remained calm and consistent, never losing his temper despite the prosecutor's aggressive questioning. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that the Hells Angels are involved in drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and murder?" "I can't speak for every member of every chapter. I can only speak for myself and the men I ride with. We're not criminals." "But you admit to striking Mr. Bradley with your fists?" "I admit to stopping 3 drunk men from murdering my friend. If that makes me guilty, then I guess I'm guilty." As the trial moved toward closing arguments, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. She'd presented a strong case, shown the jury evidence that contradicted the prosecution's story, and painted Marcus as a protector rather than an aggressor. But she also noticed troubling signs. Strange cars had been following her to and from court. Her apartment building's security guard mentioned men asking questions about her. Someone had been through her office after hours, though nothing was missing. The night before closing arguments, Sarah's phone rang again. The same calm voice delivered a more direct threat. "Last chance, counselor. Drop the case or face the consequences." Sarah hung up and looked out her apartment window. 3 motorcycles were parked across the street, their riders standing beside them like sentries. Marcus's brothers were watching over her, protecting her just as she was protecting him. She realized then that this case had become about more than proving one man's innocence. It was about standing up to a system that had already decided the outcome based on prejudice and political connections. Tomorrow, she would give the most important closing argument of her career, knowing that the Hells Angels had her back. But she also knew that winning this case would come with a price. The people behind the threats wouldn't give up easily, and she was about to find out just how far they were willing to go to protect their version of the truth. Sarah barely slept the night before closing arguments. Every sound outside her apartment made her jump. The threatening phone calls had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, but every time doubt crept in, she thought about Marcus sitting in his cell, trusting her to prove his innocence. At sunrise, she looked out her window to see the 3 motorcycles still parked across the street. The Hells Angels had maintained their vigil all night, rotating shifts to make sure she was safe. It was a strange comfort, being protected by the very people most of society feared. The courthouse was even more crowded for closing arguments. Word had spread about the dramatic testimony and the security footage that seemed to exonerate the Hells Angel. Local media had picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle between a small-time lawyer and the powerful forces trying to railroad an innocent man. D.A. Williams went first, his closing argument polished and aggressive. He stood before the jury in his perfect suit, every word carefully chosen to reinforce their prejudices. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't be fooled by clever lawyers and grainy video footage," Williams began. "The defendant is a member of a criminal organization. He used violence to solve his problems, just like his gang always does. Yes, there was a fight that night. But Marcus Thompson escalated it beyond anything reasonable or necessary." Williams pointed at the gallery where the Hells Angels sat. "Look at them. Do they look like peaceful citizens to you? They're here to intimidate you, to pressure you into letting their brother walk free. Don't let them succeed." Sarah felt anger rise in her chest. Williams was using fear tactics instead of evidence, playing on the jury's preconceptions rather than addressing the facts. But she forced herself to remain calm. Her turn was coming. "The defendant wants you to believe he was protecting a friend," Williams continued. "But protection doesn't require sending 3 men to the hospital. Protection doesn't require the level of violence we saw that night. What we have here is gang retaliation, pure and simple." When Williams finished, Sarah rose slowly and walked to the jury box. She looked each juror in the eye, establishing the personal connection that would be crucial in the next few minutes. "Mr. Williams is right about one thing," Sarah began. "This case is about fear, but not the fear he wants you to feel about my client. This case is about the fear that 3 drunk men felt when they realized they'd picked a fight with someone who wouldn't let them commit murder." Sarah gestured toward the security footage monitor. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimony. Jake Morrison was being beaten to death in that parking lot. The medical testimony confirmed that his injuries could have been fatal. Marcus Thompson stopped a murder." She walked closer to the jury, her voice growing stronger. "Mr. Williams wants you to convict my client because of the patch on his jacket. He wants you to ignore the evidence and focus on your fears. But that's not justice. That's prejudice." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes methodically destroying the prosecution's case. She reminded the jury about the witnesses' credibility problems, the inconsistencies in their stories, and the clear evidence that Bradley and his friends had been the aggressors. Derek Bradley made a deal to testify. Tommy Reeves made a deal to testify. They both had reasons to lie, reasons to point fingers at my client instead of accepting responsibility for what they did. She pointed to Marcus, who sat straight and dignified at the defense table. But my client had no reason to lie. He could have taken a plea deal. He could have avoided this trial. Instead, he chose to fight for the truth because the truth matters. Sarah's voice rose as she reached her conclusion. Marcus Thompson is not a monster. He's not a gang member who went looking for trouble. He's a man who saw his friend about to be murdered and made a choice. The right choice. The choice any of us would hope someone would make if we were lying in that parking lot with blood streaming from our heads. She looked at each juror one final time. Don't let fear make this decision for you. Look at the evidence. Listen to your conscience. And find Marcus Thompson not guilty, because that's what the evidence demands. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Sarah paced the courthouse hallway, unable to eat or concentrate on anything else. Marcus's Hells Angels brothers remained in the building, a quiet but powerful presence that reminded everyone this wasn't just another case. At 4:30 p.m., the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Sarah took her seat next to Marcus, who showed no emotion as they waited for the jury to file in. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked. The foreman, a middle-aged construction worker named Bill Patterson, stood up. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of assault and battery with a deadly weapon, how do you find? Patterson looked directly at Marcus. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The Hells Angels in the back rows stood and applauded, their faces breaking into rare smiles. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Marcus turned and hugged her, his own eyes wet with emotion. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order, but even he seemed pleased with the outcome. D.A. Williams sat stunned at the prosecution table, already calculating the political damage from losing such a high-profile case. As the courtroom cleared, several jurors approached Sarah to congratulate her. Bill Patterson, the foreman, pulled her aside. That video footage made all the difference, he said. Once we saw what really happened, the decision was easy. Your client is a good man who got caught up in a bad situation. But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. As she walked out of the courthouse with Marcus and his brothers, she noticed black SUVs parked along the street. Men in expensive suits watched from the shadows, their faces cold and calculating. Marcus noticed them too. Looks like you made some enemies today, counselor. The next morning, Sarah's law office was broken into. Her computer was destroyed, files were scattered everywhere, and a message was spray-painted on her wall. Some victories come with a price. But before Sarah could even call the police, motorcycles began arriving. Within an hour, 24 Hells Angels members surrounded her building. They didn't say much, just positioned themselves strategically and waited. When Detective Rodriguez arrived to investigate the break-in, he found the bikers sitting quietly on their motorcycles, drinking coffee and reading newspapers. They weren't threatening anyone or blocking traffic. They were just there. What's going on here? Rodriguez asked Sarah. She looked out at the men who had appointed themselves her protectors. I think they're making sure this doesn't happen again. Over the next few days, the intimidation campaign escalated. Sarah's car tires were slashed. Her apartment was burglarized. Someone threw a brick through her office window with a note attached. Drop all Hells Angels cases or face the consequences. But every attack was met with a stronger response from Marcus's brothers. More motorcycles appeared. More leather-clad men took positions around Sarah's home and office. They never threatened anyone or broke any laws, but their message was clear. Sarah Martinez was under their protection. The turning point came when Sarah received a call from Detective Rodriguez. Ms. Martinez, we've made some arrests in connection with the harassment you've been experiencing. It turned out that the men behind the intimidation campaign weren't just upset about losing the case. They were part of a larger network involving corrupt city officials and their criminal associates. Derek Bradley's uncle, City Councilman Bradley, had been taking bribes from construction companies. The men who attacked Jake had been enforcement muscle for these corrupt deals. Marcus's case had threatened to expose the whole network. If people started questioning the police reports and witness statements in his case, they might start questioning other cases as well. "Your Hell's Angels friends helped us crack this," Rodriguez explained. "They've been providing security for you, but they've also been gathering intelligence. They knew who was behind the threats before we did." Sarah was amazed. The men she'd thought were just protecting her had actually been conducting their own investigation, using their network of contacts to identify the real criminals. When the arrests were announced, the media coverage was explosive. The local news ran stories about corruption in City Hall and police department connections to organized crime. The very people who had branded the Hells Angels as criminals were exposed as the real lawbreakers. A week after the arrests, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Thompson walked into her office, but he looked different. Instead of his usual leather jacket, he wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans. "I wanted to thank you," he said, sitting across from her desk. "Not just for winning the case, but for seeing who I really am instead of what people think I am." Sarah smiled. "You don't need to thank me. You were innocent. I just proved it." Marcus shook his head. "It's more than that. You risked everything to defend me. Your career, your safety, your reputation. Most lawyers wouldn't have done that." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "The club wanted me to give you this." Inside was a patch, different from the typical Hells Angels colors. It was smaller, simpler, with just 2 words. "Friend of the club." "You'll always have our protection," Marcus explained. "If anyone ever threatens you again, if you ever need help with anything, you just call. We take care of our friends." Sarah looked at the patch, understanding the honor she was being given. In the world of the Hells Angels, friendship wasn't given lightly. It was earned through loyalty, courage, and standing up for what was right. Months later, Sarah's practice had grown significantly. Word had spread about the lawyer who wasn't afraid to take on difficult cases or powerful enemies. Other motorcycle club members began seeking her out, as did union workers, immigrants, and anyone else who felt the system was stacked against them. She kept the Hells Angels patch in a frame on her office wall, a reminder of the case that had changed her life. Sometimes clients would ask about it, and she would tell them about Marcus Thompson and the night that taught her the difference between reputation and reality. The corrupt officials were eventually convicted and sentenced to prison terms. The police officers involved in covering up the true facts of Marcus's case were fired and faced criminal charges of their own. The system that had tried to railroad an innocent man was finally held accountable. Sarah often drove past Murphy's Tavern, which had become a popular stop for motorcycle groups passing through town. The new owner, who had bought the place after the scandal broke, had embraced its reputation as the bar where justice had prevailed over prejudice. Marcus still rode with his Hells Angels chapter, but he also started a program to help other veterans transition to civilian life. He used his own experience with the legal system to advocate for fair treatment of people who looked different or belonged to groups society didn't understand. The case had taught Sarah that justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about having the courage to stand up for truth, even when that truth was unpopular or dangerous. It was about seeing past stereotypes and prejudices to find the humanity in everyone. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough and brave enough, you found that the people society feared most were the ones most willing to stand up and protect you when you needed it most. Years later, whenever young lawyers asked Sarah for advice about taking difficult cases, She would point to that patch on her wall and tell them the story of the Hell's Angels she defended and the whole gang that returned the very next day. Not for revenge or intimidation, but for protection and justice. Because sometimes the most important victories come from the most unexpected places, and the people wearing the scariest jackets turn out to have the biggest hearts.